The aviation industry is critical for Africa's prosperity as it opens up the skyline for both investment and trade opportunities within the continent and with the rest of the world. I caught up with some of the industry players for more on this. Performance of the African aviation industry is still lagging behind in comparison to other continents. Demand has nonetheless increased steadily over the past years, with passenger numbers and freight traffic growing by over 6% per annum.
Actually, Africa is growing at a higher rate than the average in terms of aviation. Yeah? So you can see that a lot of the passenger airlines are focusing on Africa because maybe their other markets are saturated. Africans are beginning to travel more. You can see it's such a huge continent, and travel has not been easy. People have been using road. They are now seeing the air transportation as an alternative. We're starting to get low-cost carriers across Africa, making air travel cheaper. So in terms of prospects, I think the next frontier in aviation is going to be Africa.
Cargo freight business is notably one of the fastest revenue generation stream across Africa's aviation industry. All this being on the back of growing trade within Africa and with continents in the likes of Asia and Europe.
I think what we are seeing in the region is the strong capability. I mean, we've got to look at it from what investment is happening in Africa. So you see it in the mining industry, so there will be a lot of movement of equipment right across the region. There's a growing consumer demand in the region, so there's export possibility for goods right across the region. There's also goods that are being exported from other countries via Nairobi to the international market. So I see that as a very strong possibility. I see also a lot of manufactured goods, because Africa, we are still importing a lot of goods, particularly from the Far East.
The demand comes from basically two sources. On the one hand is the search for resources, and here we have countries like China, countries like Brazil coming to Africa to develop these resources and look for these opportunities in the continent. And on the other hand, we have, of course, population growth of Africa, and also the upcoming middle class in Africa who have access to air transportation, and that is an unstoppable force. I mean, once people start flying, there is no way of keeping them from flying.
With capacities of airports declining due to increased demand, this calls for improved investment in airport infrastructure, which is a capital-intensive investment affair.
In terms of financing capacity development, I mean, there are basically two options. Either you can go down the path of the public sector financing, which is the case, the path that has been chosen here in Kenya, where the government has decided to finance the development of a new runway. And also the other option, of course, is to call in the private sector. And that has been the option chosen at a number of airports and a number of countries around the world. And for that, of course, you have to provide the right framework, regulatory framework, to make it really attractive for the private sector to invest in assets that are extremely expensive and that have no alternative use.
The Kenyan government has not been left out in embracing the role the private sector is playing through development partnerships.
The organization does not have the capacity to invest in all those projects. We don't have that much money. For instance, we've already started a PPP project for the airport hotel, where we are working with the World Bank and the Treasury, and where we are looking to get somebody to come and put in the project on our BOT. And I think going forward, we will do more of those kind of projects. Cargo projects actually have been on BOT. It's private sector that has put up the cargo warehouses, and we've got some arrangement where we share some revenue, and they are running the facilities as private sector.
In spite of this growth, industry players are faced with challenges which, if well addressed, will lead to improved efficiencies and growth of this fundamental industry.
Infrastructure. It's a big question, because you will not find all capability for handling, particularly because the cargo freighter is a specific aircraft that requires a different kind of approach in terms of handling. It's not just putting passenger steps and people disembark. There's all sorts of handling equipment, there's storage equipment that's required. So that has certain restrictions for certain locations. There are navigational issues in certain airports that we cannot fly to, even though there is cargo to go to those locations. For a carrier like KQ, with our safety and security requirements, we cannot fly to some of those areas. And of course, from an infrastructure point of view, you also have to say, what about the wider civil aviation regulatory perspective? Because even though there is the free movement, it is not always free. And you have these bilateral issues that do come up.
Most of the cargo freighters complain that the cargo is one way. So they go to Europe full capacity, because there's a lot of horticulture produce being exported. But in terms of imports, they come half empty, because we don't import as much. Yeah? So that's one of the challenges, because then if you're going to have a viable flight, then you've got to carry enough cargo both ways. But they're able to deal with that. Then, of course, they talk about charges. Of course, cargo handling charges could be better in order to be able to facilitate this business.
As the world embraces the untapped economic potential Africa has to offer, the aviation industry will remain pivotal in helping the continent to realize the long-awaited growth.
Economic regulation is extremely important because somehow it determines the attractiveness of airports as potential investments for many different potential players. So we obviously in ACI are pushing, we are really arguing that the regulatory regime has to be favorable for the potential investment, and in order to attract the much needed capital to develop airport infrastructure, which is absolutely fundamental for the developments, both social and economic, of all countries, and in particular in Africa. Since in the case of Africa, air transportation is not a luxury, it is actually a necessity. I mean, any country that really wants to make a statement, wants to have a place in the world, needs to have good access to air transportation, and of course airports are absolutely fundamental.